My name is Tommy Sewall. I spend a lot of my time with high schoolers and young adults. Recently, I've been hearing more and more about faith deconversions and ex-evangelical coming out stories. I have this theory that part of the problem are these often overlooked, somewhat difficult questions that arise about the Christian faith. I think by avoiding these questions, we're setting ourselves up to stumble later down the road. Join me on a journey as I track down some answers. The first place I'm heading is a small town in New York's Mohawk Valley called Broad Alban. My friend Rob is the pastor of Broad Alban Baptist Church, and I think he will be able to help. Rob is a smart guy and has decades of experience. One of the things I so appreciate about my friendship with Pastor Rob is he isn't afraid to speak the truth, and he's committed to deep, thoughtful answers. I want to ask him, is there a connection between the unanswered hard questions and people who walk away from their faith, as well as the relationship between believing and knowing? And then finally, how should we go about searching for the answers to these hard questions? Rob, do you think there's a connection between these kind of faith deconstruction stories, maybe this ex-evangelical, is there a connection between those things and some of the harder questions that surround our faith that we don't talk about as much?
Well, I think that's a complicated question that needs more than one answer. The simple answer is yes, absolutely. I think anytime we deconstruct our faith, it's because we aren't happy with it. Now, the deeper question is, why aren't we happy with it? I'm watching every year a number of our people deconstruct, and the beauty of our relationship is that we can have conversations about it. Some of the people that deconstruct their faith or walk away from it, it's because they found the excuse they were looking for, because they don't want the life obligation that's connected to faith. In other words, I don't want to, if this is my faith, I don't want to live out what this means. It's inconvenient, it's maybe in their minds boring, it's embarrassing. But the harder, the more complex issue are those who are looking for answers and either aren't satisfied with the answers, or for every answer they come up with, there are more questions. And that is the hard reality of what Paul, the apostle, calls the mystery of our salvation. The Bible really does leave some questions unanswered. It's not a science book. It's a book about God's relationship with mankind. And God's relationship with mankind, in some ways, is undefinable. So the answer is more complex than a simple yes. It's what is the mode or the motive behind my questions. Am I looking for a permission slip to walk away? You're going to find it. Am I looking for honest, concrete truth? You might not find what you're looking for. And now the next question is, well, can I have a faith that doesn't fill in all the blanks?
Why do you think we are afraid to talk about some of those questions that we would call harder questions related to our faith? Do you think that we're afraid? Do you think that? Would you agree with that?
I'm terrified. I'm not afraid personally, and we're afraid for different reasons. Some people are afraid of the questions because they're afraid that they either won't have the answer or you're not going to like the answer. I'm more afraid that if I don't give you the answer you're looking for, you are going to have a permission slip to walk away. I get devastated by people as a pastor, I pour my heart, my soul, my life into, and they find a reason to walk away, and I can't convince them of where that's going to lead them in life. So it's always a scary conversation because I don't know what you're going to do. But the flip side is, I'm also really scared about people who aren't having these conversations. I'm more devastated by people who didn't come to me and say, I have deep questions about my faith. I'm wrestling with God, they just disappear without any chance for me to say, hey, what is going on in your life? And so the very conversations that we're scared of are absolutely necessary if your faith is going to be strengthened. If I'm going to get a chance to shepherd you, is what a pastor does, shepherd you through your own wrestlings, through your own wanderings.
You feel like by not bringing up these questions that it could be viewed as like we're trying to hide certain parts of the faith? Like maybe some of the harder questions that students might have, by avoiding them, can it kind of feel like we're hiding something, or are we afraid of the answers?
I think pastors, we're normal people. We don't want to deal with self-made problems. And we certainly don't want to make problems for ourselves. And I think there is this idea that if I begin this conversation, that's a public conversation with those who are wrestling with their faith, are other people suddenly going to wrestle with their faith? The answer is maybe. It's happened. It's happened in my church. But the larger question is, if you haven't wrestled with your faith, did you ever really take hold of it? Did I just adopt my parents' faith? Yes, we're to have a faith like a child. And that's the gateway to salvation. I trust that you are real, God. I trust that you're calling me. I trust that you've saved me. But to get from milk to meat, the Bible says, it says we can't just dwell on the simple things. We have to wrestle with the more complex questions. That's where our deeper faith comes from. So if I have a whole church who's never wrestled, how do I know my church has adopted their own faith? We have to go through this. It's the terrifying necessity of working out our salvation in fear and trembling.
I think that's so interesting that you say that, because what I would interpret in the absence of some of those questions is that really what some pastors believe is not everybody has to work through this. Mm-hmm. You know, if we can almost just keep people at milk, they'll be happier. You know, mm-hmm. We can just kind of focus on this entry level. But what you're saying is, no, as a pastor, it's our job to move people from the basic understanding mm-hmm. to let's talk about, let's understand on the deepest level our faith.
And I don't think everybody has to wrestle to the point where they're wrecked. I think some people listen to the arguments. They think to themselves, well, those are interesting arguments. I see both sides, but I have no doubt in my mind that the Bible is what it says it is, that God is who he says he is, and that salvation is by grace through faith, that Jesus is real. And, you know, they don't struggle that way. But at least they've entertained the questions. But if you don't ask the questions, how can they work through them?
You're somebody who you would call yourself a thinker, right? Have you?
Yeah, I'm not a thinker. I'm not a thinker because of my own wrestlings. I'm a thinker out of necessity because I shepherd. I'm actually a dad to a thinker. My oldest daughter has wrestled and continues to wrestle with faith issues, and she's planning to go into full-time ministry. She's a thinker. And God's gift to me have been these people that he's placed in my life. I'm a simple faith guy who's had to now entertain the questions of others. And to be honest, it's deep in my own faith. So it's been a gift to me. But my thinking has been reactionary in response to those I'm called to shepherd and father.
Have there been any roads that you've been nervous to go down? Thinking-wise, questions-wise, have there been?
Yes, oh, absolutely. There are questions I just pray don't come up. And most of those have to do with cultural relevance. How do you interpret the Bible in this cultural setting? Because if you just read the Bible in black and white print, it can seem really out of touch, almost offensive. And there are certain things I can't necessarily justify or rectify to our culture, because they were written to another culture. But the truth behind Paul's writings, and Paul's one of those guys, if he lived today, man, he would be just constantly in these debate forums. The truth behind what he wrote, the truth behind the book of Jude and Hebrews, some of these books we wrestle with in the New Testament, is still true to the overarching theme of what God is doing in redeeming mankind. I've got to continually take people back to the gospel and then allow the mystery of how that fits into everybody's lives to be a mystery, to be okay with that. That's hard, especially because I tend to be a control freak. I'd love to get everybody on my page. This is not simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Is there a balance between faith and belief and just choosing to accept something versus more of like a black and white scientific logic, proof? I need scientific proof. Is there a balance in our faith? How do you find it? What do you think about that?
I wouldn't call it a balance. I'd call it an order.
Okay.
1 Thessalonians 5, 1 Corinthians 1, Philippians 1, all speak to this idea, this truth that God is the one who calls us into salvation. He initiates this conversation. So there's this gate. I mean, Jesus used the idea of a road and a gate, and the way is broad that leads to destruction. The road is narrow, it's winding, and you have to go through the gate. And he says, I am the gate, I am the door. Now, the path before the door and the path after the door look vastly different for everybody. But the process of God calling is the same. So for some people, God calls them in this emotional way. And you hear these stories. Word of Life has a lot of these stories of people that God just does this miraculous work to. I mean, Paul, a blinding light, losing his sight, losing his vision, right? There's this very visceral, emotional moment where God calls him. Paul never looks back. He doesn't wrestle with his faith after that. And then you have Peter. God calls him on the seaside, calls him away from his fishing boat, and Peter wrestles through this relationship. Even after Jesus raises from the dead, he's wrestling. He's working at his faith. He's trying to take hold of it. Thomas, the doubter, right? So for some of us, it's very emotional. It's very visceral. It happens quickly. We accept. It's real. And some of us, God allows us to think our way through it, to look for those nuggets of truth, maybe scientific knowledge. And God allows that as a part of our sanctification process. Okay, 1 Thessalonians 5, I said it talks about how God calls us, and then it says he is faithful, he will complete that work. Some of us, in the completing of that work, it's these faith wrestlings. Absolutely. And we get this opportunity to see God be patient with us and bring more knowledge and more truth to us, and God in his grace to leave some of the questions unanswered, because it is a faith after all. Faith is not a science. It can utilize science, but faith is higher than a science.
So what would you say to somebody that said, I'm just not somebody who can believe in faith. I need to be able to see proof in order for me to be able to accept something.
I would tell someone like that, you will never find enough proof, because for every question you find an answer to, you will find another or several more unanswered questions. That is the mystery that Paul speaks of.
To somebody who said, I don't need any proof, I just believe everything, even I will believe it, even if you were to show me evidence against it. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that person? Is that okay? Is that healthy?
I would say I covet that kind of faith, but I fear that kind of faith, because a lot of times that faith is built on this idea that I don't want to entertain anything else. And so the first time that faith doesn't measure up, i.e. a great tragedy in your life, those are the people I tend to watch their faith crumble. I also tend to see those people in those times begin to build a stronger and more real faith. I think there's a possibility for that. I just haven't experienced that. And I probably would guess most of us haven't experienced that. But I wouldn't say that can't happen. We have to have faith that faith can be simple, just as much as we can have faith that faith can be complex and still be real.
Should somebody feel bad, or what would you say to a student that says, I believe in Jesus, but I'm investigating. I want to understand on a deeper level than just the surface, I believe it. I want to dive into it. What would you say?
I think you have to ask yourself, what are you looking for? Are you looking for God to reveal himself to you? Or are you hoping in your heart that you can prove him false? Get to the motive of where your questions come from first. Because where your questions come from determines what you're after. If you're looking to disprove God so that you can have the out clause, the get out of jail free card, and move away from your faith, you're going to find it. Plain and simple. Because you're going to find a question that can't be answered on this side of heaven. If that's your motive, just be honest. And maybe save yourself some time. That sounds harsh. And isn't meant to be harsh. My prayer is that the motive behind your questions are that God would strengthen your faith. That's where apologetics is important. I can't win the world through apologetics. I can certainly work through my own wrestlings, my own wanderings. Because faith, after all, has to be accepted and received. Faith isn't proven. Hebrews says we understand God created the world by faith, not scientific proof. And this is where it's important as we have these conversations with Darwinists. Darwin never nailed down the missing links. This is a faith issue. Yes, it involves science, but you still have to accept the theory of evolution on faith, just as people would say the theory that we worship a God who rose from the dead and created all there is a faith.
So a student that inside them right now, even as we're talking, they're interested in finding out more information. Mm-hmm. You're saying that that's not bad, but proceed with caution. Know what you're looking for.
Know what your motive is. Know why you're doing it. And I would say one more thing. It's okay to put a timeline. It's okay at some point to say, you know what, I've gathered enough evidence. My daughter came to the point where she looked at her life and said, okay, I can't prove to you that everything I believe is real. But I can tell you, if I walk away from this faith, I can tell you what I know my life is going to look like, and I don't want to go that direction. And so, knowing the advantage, it is okay to say, people call it a crutch. You can call it that if you want. I'll take a crutch all day if it helps me walk. But I know the advantage of placing my hope and trust in the gospel reality is going to do more for my life and bring more hope and peace to my life than going off after nothing. And so I'm going to choose to dwell here. And so what ends up happening is you put a timeline on it and say, oh, I'm going to keep asking questions, but there's going to come a point where maybe I'm not going to ask questions anymore. It's going to become a real habit. It can become I think the questions themselves can become a crutch or a weakness, something we hold on to. The pearl inside of the clam that just continues to collect the sand. Mm-hmm. And at some point you just say, you know what? It just leads to more questions. I'm going to let go of the questions now. If God brings me more questions, great, but I'm just going to rest now. Rest in this faith. I have enough evidence. I have seen the life change in my life. I have had God reveal things to me. And the other thing we don't talk about is bold prayers. In our faith struggles, to do as much praying and conversing with God as we do reading. God, reveal yourself to me. One of the prayers I constantly bring to my people, I've talked about it on the island at the Bible Institute, is this prayer, and I pray this prayer virtually every day in my life. God, speak to me in ways that are unmistakable and undeniable, that demand a response or a change. And I pray that every day, because if my faith is real, then the relationship is real. And so I want God to speak beyond just my questions. I want him to speak to me in a real way. That's a bold faith prayer that we don't pray enough.
Speaking about your daughter in this journey that she went on, what was that like for you to kind of hard. See it?
Yeah, it was hard. I intentionally let her struggle and figure out the answers. I didn't fill in the blanks for her. Because if I did, it's just Dad wanting me to be a Christian because he's a Christian. Being a Jesus follower because he's a Jesus follower. And he's a pastor. You know, there's this misnomer that pastors' kids aren't allowed to struggle. We as pastors need our kids to struggle. First of all, they're bringing knowledge and wisdom to the table for us to learn from. Secondly, they're the ones most at risk for the sake of their parents' reputation of just playing the great pretend. And so we had deep battles for 4 years. We stayed up till midnight or later, 3 or 4 nights a week, just conversing. She still has questions to this day. She's been through the BI. She loves the Lord with all her heart. She works in full-time ministry and is pursuing that as her, long-lasting career. And still, every once in a while, she'll have to say to me, Dad, I'm wrestling today. I had to sit down and pray and set aside those questions. And she gave me permission to share all this. If she was here, she would love to be in this conversation. She's up serving at a camp right now, but that's been hard for me to walk with her. And yet it's been so rich.
So how did you see it change her faith as she kind of, I'm assuming it was a relatively long journey that she was on, but how did you see her faith change through it?
I saw her make active choices to let go of the unanswered questions. And that's where the faith really begins. Having a faith based on answers is not a faith. That's a science. That's fact. Your faith actually begins when you get to those questions that are unanswerable on this side of heaven, and you still choose to follow the Lord. And when she did that, when she got to that point where she says, okay, here's the questions I can't answer, and I still see value in going in this path and following the Lord and following the scriptures, that's when I saw the light really return in her eyes, and she had the freedom to accept that this is a relationship beyond description. And that makes it special. And that makes it something I want. There's this hymn.
Powerful.
It says, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his glorious grace, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And that's where she got to.
That's powerful. What would you say, what advice would you give me or would you give to a student who is saying, I have some questions, or in my case, I want to explore some of the lesser talked about areas. What would be a pattern, or what advice would you give me to what does that look like? How should that be?
Well, I would ask a question, would you be willing to give your pastor the great esteemed privilege of shepherding you through those questions? And if you're willing, are you willing to actually sit down and talk? And one of the difficult things for me as a pastor is I get these questions in text or email or instant message or even on my Facebook page. I can't answer some of your hardest and deepest questions in text. I won't do it justice. We need time together. And I think, pastors are busy, yes. And pastors don't always have the answers. But if you will do your pastor the great honor and esteemed privilege of asking these questions and saying, can we sit down over coffee or lunch, or can we take time in your office? Can I just ask you these questions? We would be thrilled. Now, here's the second part. We as pastors have to be willing to be honest and say, I don't have the answers. Now, there's one of two things I can do. I can either lie to you and make up something, and then as soon as you leave my office, find my books and see if I was right. Or I can in real time say, I haven't entertained this question. I haven't nailed this one down. Either it's a mystery and God says it's a mystery and I have to be okay with that, or let's discover together. And this is where the great learning comes in for pastors. It is a gift to us for you to ask us a question we don't have answers to, because now we get to learn in real time with you. That takes some humbling on the side of pastors to say, I don't know everything. But it also takes a willingness for our teens, especially in our church. You can ask just as much as you love your youth pastor, you can ask your senior pastor a question. He might be in his 60s and 70s, and he would still love to talk to you. That's where the relevance of Scripture enters, are these conversations. So do us the great, courteous privilege of allowing us to be a part of the conversation.
And as you're saying that, I'm just having this thought. Isn't that so interesting? Because the Bible clearly prescribes to everybody who's going to be a Jesus follower community. It clearly describes this relationship, and really even inside of the church between the pastor and the leadership of the church and the people who are in the church of
Yeah.
this coming along and
right.
teaching, instructing. And so as you're talking about that, I'm just thinking about like God designing people in a certain way,
Yeah.
designing people's
right.
minds in a certain way, because he knows that the way that this is supposed to work is you come to your pastor and say, I need help understanding this, and that is a prescription in the Bible for what it looks like to follow Jesus.
It is, and you look at the early church, it was organic. They were spending time breaking bread together, working in their fields together, hosting people coming through, their cities together. There was this ongoing conversation over the daily life. And we're not spending, okay, we'll hit sporting events, it's great. We'll go to camps and conferences and entertainment venues, we'll go to concerts, awesome. But we need the organic day-to-day life to be in community, and we need to be strategic about the conversations. So let's not just waste time today. Maybe it's not a waste, maybe that's not the right word, but let's not miss the opportunity. Maybe that's the way we say it. To get into the deeper issues of what's going on inside of us. Let's not be surface level community. And I think the more we entertain the deeper conversations, the more these kind of conversations will come out of wrestling with faith, or wrestling with how do I bring culture and scripture together and make sense of it.
I'm super grateful for Pastor Rob taking time out of his schedule to sit down and talk with me. I feel like the conversation was very helpful, and hopefully you did too. It's given me plenty to think about and ponder as I continue on this journey. One of the things he said that really resonated with me is the importance of sitting down face to face with people who you trust and asking them questions. The questions I have for the next episode are some tough ones, and I know exactly where I need to go.